PlayStation 3 will retail for $599 US.
The lifespan of the PlayStation 3 was a highly tumultuous one. If you were to suggest to a PlayStation 2 owner during the height of the 6th console generation that the PlayStation 3 launch went so poorly that there were questions if Sony would go the way of Sega, they would probably call you crazy. If you were to suggest in 2007 to anyone who followed gaming news and hardware that despite the weak launch, the PlayStation 3 would eventually come to outsell the Xbox 360, they too might call you crazy. And the thought to anyone today that it was ever possible, with the aid of hindsight, that there was a point when the commercial failure of the PlayStation 3 was a real possibility is inconceivable. Needless to say, the PlayStation 3 experienced one of the craziest lifespans in one of the most contentious console generations in the history of video game consoles. Going from overpriced joke to being considered one of the greatest consoles of all time, the PlayStation 3 saw many evolutions over the near decade it reigned as Sony's flagship console, and its success and near failure helped to shape the direction of its eventual successor. This is the PlayStation 3, the comeback king. The PlayStation 2 had barely breathed its first in the global console market when development on its successor began in 2001. STI, a coalition consisting of Sony, Toshiba, and IBM, began development of the processor that would inadvertently define the 7th generation of gaming. Following in the same direction taken with the Emotion engine, the Cell, or broadband engine, was a multi-core processor that combined a PowerPC-based core with modest performance and paired it with multiple other co-processing elements, which helped to streamline performance. The purpose of this new broadband engine was to have applications in multimedia, vector processing, and several other forms of dedicated computation. The architecture of the Cell made it very capable and has been used in clusters of supercomputers to perform such tasks as image analysis, protein folding, and running simulations related to the study of black holes. Because of the focus on low power consumption relative to performance, it proved to be an efficient processor compared to other more conventional supercomputer processors, making its operations significantly cheaper to run. That being said, the Cell, also being the main processor for the PlayStation 3, was also its Achilles heel. While it was a very capable processor, it was also, much like the Emotion engine, very complicated to program for. The Cell, as it existed in the PlayStation 3, consisted of a single power processing element and 8 synergistic processing elements, one of which was disabled in manufacturing and the other reserved for the operating system. The power processing element's job is to dictate tasks to the synergistic processing elements. The synergistic processing elements, in turn, would do most of the heavy lifting in executing their respective instructions. Despite the fact that the Xeon processor in the Xbox 360 would itself contain 3 threaded cores consisting of 3 power processing elements, because of the former's far less conventional design, it proved very difficult to program video games for. This would be one of the factors that would play into the PlayStation 3's launch difficulties. When the technical specifications for the Xbox 360 were revealed, the team at STI urged Sony to modify the design of the PlayStation 3 to include an additional GPU alongside the Cell processor. Originally, it was intended for the PlayStation 3 to rely on the Cell exclusively, but once it was discovered that the Cell wouldn't be enough by itself to keep the new hardware competitive with Microsoft, Sony added a GPU late into the design of the console. It is pretty obvious that Sony intended for the PlayStation 3 to be gamers' one-stop shop for all PlayStation games, meaning that it would be the ultimate PlayStation. Even if you were late to the party coming from the Microsoft or Nintendo sphere, and you had an interest in games that were only released on the PlayStation or PlayStation 2, or those ports of those games included content exclusive to those particular ports, then you wouldn't have to worry about having to go back and buy the old hardware. The PlayStation 3 was designed to be completely backwards compatible with games on previous hardware. PlayStation games would be backwards compatible via software emulation, and the PlayStation 2 games would be supported with native PlayStation 2 hardware. This meant that the original models of PlayStation 3 not only consisted of the Cell processor and its GPU, but also included the Emotion Engine and graphics synthesizer built into the PlayStation 2 as well. It truly was the ultimate Sony game console in its conception, but it came at a staggering cost. The PlayStation 3 was an extremely ambitious endeavor by Sony. For a piece of consumer electronics hardware, it included a lot of technology. A cutting-edge CPU that would see use in supercomputer clusters, native PlayStation 2 hardware, HDMI support with full HD video, support for a whole array of different memory storage devices including flash cards, SD cards, and USB sticks on top of the addition of a user-modifiable internal hard drive. All of this, as well as the inclusion of a Blu-ray drive, it was clear that the PlayStation 3 was a premium machine that was meant not only to exist in the gaming sphere, but to also be included into the greater sphere of Sony's electronics ecosystem. It included compatibility with a whole suite of Sony's products, and in retrospect, seemed like an attempt by Sony to pivot more into the marketing direction of premium tech like Apple than to be a dedicated gaming system. It would make sense that this would be the direction Sony would take with the PlayStation 3, since research and development of the Cell alone cost Sony an amount to the tune of $400 million. Sony was taking a risk with the PlayStation 3, but after the decisive and resounding success of the PlayStation 2, it seems reasonable to think that this risk would be worth taking. If you could convince consumers who had bought the PlayStation 2 to trade in their old hardware to use as a credit to put towards their purchase of a PlayStation 3 without the need for them to worry about their libraries of PlayStation 2 games not being compatible, they might not worry so much about the cost of the PlayStation 3, which at the time retailed at $499 for the 20GB model and $599 for the 60GB model. Adjusted for inflation in 2023, that would set the 20GB model at $760 and the 60GB model at $910, making the PlayStation 3 at launch the most expensive PlayStation of all time, far more expensive than 2024's comparatively modestly priced PlayStation 5 Pro. The eventual reveal of the PlayStation 3 received little fanfare and a lot of criticism. For many, the price of the PlayStation 3 was far too high for what was on offer. While, yes, the PlayStation 3 did offer a lot of high-tech features and was very forward-thinking in the way it was engineered, the console lacked the software to help move units. While it did have a launch lineup, it seemed clear that Sony was banking on having a launch of similar strength to the PlayStation 2 by following the PlayStation 2 launch strategy. Offer consumers some games which demonstrate what is possible on the console, with the promise of even better software to come in the future, while offering the cheapest Blu-ray player on the market up front, in a similar way the PlayStation 2 was to DVD players at its launch. Essentially, hope consumers will come for the media playback function and stay for the software. While this might have seemed to have made sense at the time, the Blu-ray format really didn't have the same strength in the market as DVD had in the past, and even though the PlayStation 3 was the cheapest player for Blu-ray discs and could also play DVDs, a number of issues arose from this, one of which being the fact that the PlayStation 3 would ship with composite video cables, which did not support HD formats, totally mitigating the advantages of the Blu-ray format. Of course, the reason why PlayStation 3s shipped with composite cables was simply because of the fact that many consumers were still using standard definition televisions that didn't have component or HDMI capability. While one could say that the PlayStation 3 was future-proofing itself more securely than the Xbox 360, it was also the main selling point for the PlayStation 3 at its launch, since its software library was lacking. Because of the huge cost of entry into the world of high-definition media and the high price of the PlayStation 3, it gave the console an air of unreachability in the way its competition didn't. Even when you look at the PlayStation 3's design against the designs of the Xbox 360 and the Wii, the PlayStation 3's design gives it a very premium look with its piano black convex top with PlayStation 3 in the Spider-Man font stretched across it, the shiny chrome trim that runs along the front of the console and around the disc slot. Personally, when I was a kid looking at the three consoles side by side, the Wii and the Xbox 360 looked like dedicated gaming machines in contrast to the PlayStation 3, which appeared more like a centralized piece of entertainment equipment that also played games on the level of the Xbox 360. The PlayStation 3 lacked exclusive software and came at a very high cost at launch. This became a bit of a meme after it was released, with many saying how the PlayStation 3 was a $600 console that had no games. Because of the complex nature of the hardware's architecture, developers would have difficulty programming games for the PlayStation 3, and so early multi-platform games' performance would noticeably suffer compared to the Xbox 360 for the first few years after its release. This would make the PlayStation 3 the less ideal platform for multi-platform third-party games for most of the generation, and thanks to the Xbox's timed exclusivity deal with Activision with Call of Duty, easily the best-selling franchise of that generation of consoles, the PlayStation 3 had a steep hill to climb. After a slow start in the first third of its lifespan, Sony worked diligently to rebrand the PlayStation 3. Starting as early as the second year in the console's life, Sony began cutting costs by omitting the inclusion of the PlayStation 2 hardware, going the route of limited software emulation. The PlayStation 3 would also receive a slim model and a massive price cut. Thanks to the development of an even smaller version of the cell processor, the PlayStation 3 Slim would be considerably smaller than its original design. It would also receive a similar change in its logo and naming, moving away from the Spider-Man font PlayStation 3 wrapped across the width of the console's piano black convex back to a much more utilitarian, unpretentious matte black, still convex back with PS3 engraved into it. Its chrome trim was replaced with a simpler black plastic and including real power and eject buttons rather than the touch-sensitive surfaces of the previous version. This new repackaging of the PlayStation 3 looks much more like a gaming machine and with an appropriate asking price. But as anyone in the gaming industry would tell you, hardware doesn't sell itself. While marketing did help resuscitate the PlayStation 3's image, what really helped to push it over the edge were its first-party titles. By the time this revised version of the PlayStation 3 was released and it became more accessible to more people, the back catalog of excellent first-party titles that had already been released, as well as the promise of more to come, was part of what helped to bring consumers to PlayStation 3. While Xbox Live was considered the premier experience for online multiplayer games, Sony's system for online multiplayer for games came at no cost and seemed to be just as capable as Xbox Live. Aside from the huge hack of PlayStation Online services that took place, which somewhat tarnished the reputation of the service as being less secure than Xbox Live, overall, it's safe to assume that those who did play online via Sony's online service appreciated it was free, especially considering the backlash Sony would receive when they announced the introduction of a paid subscription model for its next generation. About midway through the generation, Sony would also introduce PlayStation Move. Since motion controls were the hot new item in that generation of consoles, and with the Wii seeing great success because of its implementation of motion controls and their peripherals, of course Sony and Microsoft would want to eventually get in on that action. While Microsoft would go a completely different route with the Kinect, Sony would introduce PlayStation Move, which was essentially a technologically superior version of what was on the Wii. The controllers essentially behave and control more according to the way consumers were expecting the Wii's controllers to. Puzzlingly enough, however, there wasn't nearly as much emphasis put on marketing the PlayStation Move as there was with Kinect, and while at the time this might have been curious, it probably was better for Sony's marketing of the PlayStation brand in the long run. PlayStation Move's technology would see some application in the future of Sony products, such as PSVR in the following generation, which is interesting considering what the future of motion controls for both Nintendo and Microsoft would look like in succeeding generations, but the comparatively lacking emphasis on the marketing of PlayStation Move helped to make PlayStation 3's image more about providing options to players rather than attempting to push the whole brand in that direction. This is likely what would help set Sony's trajectory for the layup that was the 8th generation. Of course, the launch PlayStation 3 did include some level of motion controls with its 6-axis controller, but the motion control technology in the 6-axis controller was rarely ever utilized, and Sony eventually ended up replacing it with the DualShock 3. Thanks to stalling quality of first-party software and performance parity between Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 on multi-platform games, more or less, the Xbox 360 rapidly ran out of steam in the late part of the 7th generation consoles, while the PlayStation 3 continued to surge. The Last of Us, releasing on PlayStation 3 just before the release of the PlayStation 4, was the PlayStation 3's victory lap. Seeing a third and final hardware revision in the end stages of its life as Sony's flagship, the PlayStation 3 continued to move units even into the PlayStation 4's lifespan, eventually eclipsing the Xbox 360 in units sold. Despite its earlier launch and advantages of being backed by a company with more money than God to prop it up through its own controversies and mishaps, the PlayStation 3 came in from behind at the last minute and seized the crown. With the PlayStation 3 performing as badly as it did at launch, it was almost mind-blowing to witness those numbers go higher than the 360. While of course the Wii finished with more units sold above all, the contest between Sony and Microsoft in the 7th generation was truly a sight to behold. I remember the launch of the PlayStation 3 and how it took place just a couple days before the Wii. I remember going into my local Walmart and seeing empty cases where Wiis were supposed to be, and cases full to the brim with PlayStation 3s. It seemed like retailers couldn't get rid of that initial stock, and it didn't seem crazy to me at the time, considering just how out of reach the PlayStation 3 was for people I knew in my real life, thanks to its price. I always thought the launch version looked the best though, despite its non-gamey design. But it always intrigued me that when my longtime childhood friend finally got his PS3 Slim, I was really interested to see how it stacked up against the Xbox 360, a console which I had become intimately familiar with after seeing an Elite model being listed as an available item in my elementary school's book fair catalog. I remember going from a time where a number of my friends had Xbox 360s early in the 7th generation, but in the latter half, more of my friends had PS3s, having finally gotten them once the price cuts started happening. While most of my friends waited for PlayStation 3 to become more affordable, I did know a couple people who emigrated from Xbox 360 to PlayStation 3, although it was nothing like the mass exodus that would take place with the release of the Xbox One. The PlayStation 3 was and still is a fascinating console. Very few console manufacturers stumble so hard out of the gate and manage to recover, let alone come out on top the way the PlayStation 3 did. While the PlayStation and PlayStation 2 had their fair share of highly acclaimed and celebrated exclusive titles, I personally believe that this aspect of exclusives, which have become so ubiquitous in the PlayStation brand at this point, really started in earnest with PlayStation 3. I believe it is the fact that there were as many high-quality first and second-party games released for the console across its entire lifespan that allowed for a couple of things to happen. First, they gave consumers a compelling reason to adopt the hardware, even if they had an Xbox already. And second, because it would give third-party developers more time to become more familiar with how to utilize the cell architecture properly so as to bring performance parity of their game to PlayStation 3 with Xbox 360. By the end of the generation, there were more reasons to buy a PlayStation 3 than an Xbox 360, since now the multi-platform issue had mostly been mitigated, and even going into the cross-generation phase of their life, the PlayStation 3 managed to keep pace with the Xbox 360 across cross-generation multi-platform games for the most part. Where most, if not all, had failed, Sony managed to succeed. PlayStation 3 did lose some things along the way. PlayStation 2 backwards compatibility would be lost through the omission of the built-in PS2 hardware and the eventual patching out of built-in software emulation in favor of the PlayStation Store and digital downloads. PlayStation 3's ambition for being the ultimate PlayStation might have fallen through, but what we did get was a great console whose, quote, untapped potential at launch would be put on full display and allowed to thrive in a market that could now fully appreciate the cell and what it could do. From the consumer side of things, PlayStation 3 did a lot to earn back its trust, and when people look back at the 7th generation now as being a bygone golden age of gaming, I think that the highly competitive environment between the three console manufacturers really did a lot to help create that feeling. I think that atmosphere of having to fight for the consumer's dollar was what helped create the flourish we now see that took place in 2005 to 2013, regardless of what you might think about the industry today. Whether or not we are now better for the decisions Sony made in the 7th generation, we can only speculate, but for PlayStation 3, it was one heck of a ride and a comeback to remember.